Welcome to Killer Women with your host, best-selling author Danielle Girard. And now, Danielle's next killer woman.
Hello, and welcome to Killer Women Podcast, a proud member of the Authors on the Air Global Network with more than 4 million listeners. I am your host, suspense author Danielle Girard, and my guest today is Caroline Wolff. Caroline is a writer and editor. She holds an MFA in fiction from New York University, where she also taught undergraduate creative writing. She lives in downtown Manhattan, and The Wayside is her first novel. And I don't have a physical copy of it. We were just talking about, neither of us has a physical copy of it, but here's the gorgeous cover. Welcome, Caroline.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm so excited to have you. And you're a debut author, which we were just talking a little bit before recording. It's the most exciting thing. It's kind of like your wedding. You got to kind of enjoy all the moments. So tell us all a little bit about The Wayside.
Sure. So The Wayside opens with two hikers who are hiking along kind of a relatively isolated trail along the rocky cliffs in Northern California. This trail is sort of like, and if you know, sort of a place among the hiking community, because it summits at this place that the locals call the Wayside. So the Wayside is the site of a former mansion that was built by an eccentric oil tycoon around the turn of the century. It was burned down in the 1920s. So it's kind of like this creepy, eerie place with all these ruins. So hikers know about it, and the college students at the local university know about it, of course, and they go and party there because it's just this incredible spot. So we have our two hikers. They reach the summit. They step to the edge of the cliff to look out at this incredible view. And one of them spots a dead body lying at the bottom of the cliff in a ravine. So the body turns out to be the body of Jake Cleary, who was a 20-year-old student at the University of Paloma College. So we then cut to Jake's mother, Kate, who is our protagonist, and she takes us through the rest of the novel with like occasional kind of interstitials from other characters' perspectives. Kate is a high-powered attorney at a tech firm in San Francisco. She is killing it at work. She just dealt with this major merger. She's like never taken a day off in her life. Maybe there was some mat leave thrown in there, but she's very focused on her work. But of course, with the news of her son's death, her life is completely upended. She's consumed by grief and by shock. So she takes like an indefinite sabbatical from her job. She packs up her things in San Francisco and she moves into Jake's apartment off campus, and essentially ingratiates herself into Jake's life. She's just really trying to put the pieces together to figure out how this death could have happened. So she reads over his journals, his class notes. She goes to his classes. She tries to connect with his friends.
Yeah.
So initially the police aren't sure whether his death was intentional or if it was accidental.
Right.
Eventually she finds a suicide note, what appears to be a suicide note, sort of hidden among Jake's journals. The police accept it as such. They declare his death by suicide, and they close the case. But Kate, there's something about this note that really sets off alarm bells for Kate. It's written very cryptically in this tone that like doesn't ring true to the son that she's known.
Right.
And it also kind of seems to point towards other players who potentially could have played a role in Jake's death. So, and then another student dies shortly thereafter, which makes her think, okay, these deaths, first of all, are connected in some way, and that there's also something really sinister going on this campus. So,
right.
Yeah.
And really, so the premise of the start of the story, which makes so much sense, right, is this mother who has lost her only child, right? I mean, she's a
Yeah.
career-driven woman. She's divorced from Jake's
Hmm.
dad, John. And he's, he's sort of, I mean, I think as it happens, right, men and women handle grief very differently in general.
Hmm.
And obviously every two people handle it differently. But we are so immersed in Kate's, in her, this life. I mean, she's living sort of a fantasy life of trying to sort of extrapolate from almost no information, right? I mean, she's looking
Hmm.
through the poetry books he read, all of his textbooks, just looking for his,
Hmm.
he writes in green pen. She's just looking for the evidence of who he was.
Yeah.
And he's a sensitive child, who, and I have a sensitive son too. It's just
Hmm.
interesting, like, you worry about them, and then they get to a certain age and you think, okay, my kid's got it, and all of a sudden
Yeah.
everything is ripped out from under her.
Yeah.
And there are so many, I mean, and from the perspective of the police, because the police officer has a really big role in the book as well. I
Hmm.
love the world you created. It's funny because I grew up in Northern California, and so
Oh.
yeah, so I'm like, I'm trying to sort of place it in. Obviously, I know it's a fictitious, Paloma
Hmm.
is a fictitious university, which is fabulous. But I can picture, I have my own sort of image of what this place looks like, and I think you do a beautiful job of evoking that, which is
Thank
because
you.
the university, the town, is very much its own character in the book, right? I mean,
Hmm.
you have the little cafe that's run by the man who lost his partner, who was a chef,
Hmm.
so he's now taken that
Yeah.
over. And then you have, the woman who's a TA who becomes, part of her
Hmm.
story. And anyway, it's really beautiful. And the police officer comes to that cafe sort of like clockwork, I'm sure, like in all
Hmm.
these small towns.
Right.
And so, but really, to be able to evoke that, the desperation of a mother who's lost her kid and
Hmm.
doesn't understand it. I'm
Yeah.
assuming you look too young. You don't have children.
I don't have children, no, and I certainly don't have a 20-year-old
I was gonna say
child.
you look like you
But
might be 20, so I'm gonna guess you don't have a
oh no,
20-year-old.
I'm older than that, but no,
I
I don't
know,
have
I believe you
children.
are. But so tell us about, because I think, and not to say that you have to be a mother to write about this, but I'm
Yeah.
curious to know sort of where this idea came from. I want to
Mhm.
talk too about sort of your process, because I know this is your first book, and I love to dig into sort of how you got here, because that's
Yeah.
everybody who's aspiring, writing their first book or the third book who hasn't published yet is trying to get to where you are. So, but let's
Yeah.
start with the story. Like, where did it come from?
Hmm.
And sort of what was the inspiration for Kate and for Jake and for this
Hmm.
whole Paloma world?
Yeah. Well, I mean, this question ties into the other question about process and
Yeah,
how
yeah,
the book sort of came to life. Um, because it's a bit of an unusual and I think interesting story in terms of like the
yes.
publishing world. So, essentially, the Wayside was like a collaboration with Assemble Media, which is a production company that specializes in developing short stories and novels.
Okay,
So
interesting. I've
yes,
never heard of them.
really unusual. I know. Yeah, I mean, they're an incredible company. Um, so basically, like, I was hooked up to Assemble through a friend who, um, at that point, I had graduated from my MFA program a
Mm,
couple years earlier. I had just put like the finishing touches on my first novel.
mm,
And I was hustling to try to get representation for that novel.
right.
And that book was like, it wasn't genre, it was like really contemporary fiction, like kind of a classic coming of age novel that drew really heavily on my own experience and my own emotional landscape. So, not in any kind of a thriller genre world.
Yeah.
But when this pitch for The Wayside sort of came across my desk, um, there was something about it that resonated with me so deeply. And interestingly, too, I could see how it could deal in themes that I had explored in my first book, and also that as a writer, I always gravitate towards. So, like
Yeah.
things like power dynamics and relationships and
Mm,
sexuality, especially female sexuality, like battling your inner demons and like adolescence and coming of age. Like that was, I could see
Mm-hmm.
all of those pieces in
Mm-hmm.
this pitch for the Wayside. And even though it was a genre that I wasn't familiar with, I could see how I could like kind of come at it from like a literary fiction angle and like make it
Yeah.
really character focused and, you know, style and language focused, but also have this like really delicious engine of like the plot and like all the
Yeah.
mysteries. So it just was like a perfect fit. And it was so, it was very unexpected. It was not, you know, the first, it's not my, technically not my first novel. It's my first published novel,
Well, yeah. I
but
mean, most people who publish a novel, it's not their first novel, right? I mean, it's
yes,
very rare to have
yeah,
that be the thing. But I'm so curious about
totally.
this. So you said the pitch. So basically,
Mhm.
this company Assemble
Mhm.
pulls has pitches that they sort of show you. You basically read the pitches and decide if there's a book you want to write. Is that how that works? This is so new to me. I've not
I'll tell,
heard anything
yeah,
like it. Yeah. So tell
it's
us about it.
fascinating. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't, to be fair, I don't know how they work with all of their writers, but I do know
Yes.
that they work with writers at every stage of their career. So,
Yeah.
New York Times bestsellers to debut writers.
Yeah.
So they like develop ideas internally, and then they go out to find the writers who want to write that project.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I got sort of like a 2-page synopsis. And then, you know, I sent them my first novel just to make sure it would be a really good fit. And you know, from the start, Assemble, like they let me take that synopsis and run with it. Like I
Mm-hmm.
recently went back to read that original synopsis just to like jog my memory, like how did this all start? And it was interesting because, you know, the shape of the story is similar and, you know, it presents like the four major characters in the novel,
Mm-hmm.
but the rest of it, like they really trusted me to change it, to like take it in all these different directions that just felt right to me.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it very much it feels like it's my book, but it's not actually like the seed of my original idea, which was like
Right.
just this really cool kind of collaborative effort.
And did they tell you, we're not talking about the ending, but did they tell you
Yeah.
sort of like the major plot twists, like how it's going to end?
Yeah. So yes, one of the major plot twists is in there.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like all of like the mechanics and all of the details
Mm-hmm.
of how we get there, that was like they were like, Caroline, do it. Like take it away.
Okay. Okay. That's so you could have come at it a million different ways, right? I mean, the seed of an
Yeah.
idea is obviously valuable. I mean, right? I think we all
Yeah.
like that's sort of like the magic that we're looking for, but that's like 1% of the process, right? I mean, it's when it comes
Totally.
to sort of creating. So then, okay, so then you wrote this, and then does it go back to
Mhm.
it went back to Assemble, and then did they help you find an agent for it, or how does that work?
Yeah. So in this scenario, Assemble essentially acted as my agent. And so Assemble was the one who took it out to publishers, and we ended up with Blackstone, which is an
Mm-hmm.
incredible publisher. I'm so
Yeah, I
happy to
love
work with
Blackstone.
them. I love
Yeah, they're
them.
wonderful. Yeah.
Um, so I like, again, it's so not traditional. It wasn't like what I
Yeah,
was trained to expect when I was in grad school. Like this is totally a
right.
new concept. So yeah, I don't like Assemble was my agent on this
So interesting.
project.
I just love
Yeah,
the fact that publishing is getting more and more innovative because,
totally.
my first book came out in 2000, which is a long time ago now.
Mhm.
And it like there was only one way to do it. You were only going to
Yeah.
write in one genre. You had to really stay in your lane. Like everything was
Hmm.
so restrictive for the author and made it really hard obviously to grow and to as a author, as a writer, and to make a living. I mean, it was all so much harder. And I love this. This is really, really interesting. So if the company's called
Yeah.
Assemble.
Yes, Assemble Media. Yeah, and I mean, I think publishing still has like a lot of gatekeepers, and I agree that it's starting to innovate and evolve, to kind of like meet the moment and meet the reality of like the way that
Yeah,
writers work.
right.
Um, but what I appreciated about Assemble so much was like at that point I was so hungry to write and for people to read my writing. Like I love
Yeah.
my first novel. I loved it. I still believe in it.
Yeah.
But I was really like, I'm a writer because I want to tell stories that people read, and
Right.
Assemble like put their trust into me. Like they saw that and they were like, we're going to give you a shot. And it's just so hard as a debut novelist to get that shot. Like you need
Yeah.
someone to open the gate for you. And
Yeah.
this is like a really interesting way of doing that.
Yeah. Super exciting. So, okay. So now
Yeah.
from here, is the next step, they give, like, you sort of, are you looking at other synopsis from them and you do it again, or, how does that work?
Yeah. I mean, as far as where I'm at right now, I don't have another project through Assemble. I'm working on something individually, but I
Yeah.
think that's, it can be an
Right.
option. And I am really curious to see if um, other companies, other agencies sort of start to develop this model.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's sort of like, it's sort of like the way, this is one of the things we talk about a lot too, is that the way like TV writers work, where they
Yeah,
all get in a room and like hash out an idea, which, book authors really should do too, because it's an opportunity
100%.
to sort of like look at everything from a different perspective and be, as
Mhm.
one brain, you're like, you miss your own holes, you don't see the full picture,
Yes.
you don't ask all the right questions, like how's that going to work and what about this, and yeah, if we all sort of just, we could even just do it with like 10 ideas, right? 10 authors, 10 ideas, you just hash them out and everybody goes
Hmm.
home to write their own idea.
Yeah.
um and so I think this is sort of what it sounds like Assemble is doing, is they're in a room hashing out ideas so that by the time
Hmm.
they deliver an idea, it's you're not gonna get 20,000 words in and be like, oh, this doesn't work. Which every author I know
Yeah.
who's written more than a few books has gotten to that point where they're like, oh shit, this is all gonna end up on the
Yeah.
cutting room floor because it doesn't work. So I
Yeah.
think that's kind of brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I know it's funny because we think of writing as such like an insular sort of hermetic
Solitary. Yeah.
solitary activity.
Totally.
But what I've learned, I mean, I learned a little bit of this when I was in grad school when we were in like a workshop setting.
Hmm.
And you throw ideas out at each other and you feel like you have a community of people. But throughout the publishing process too, it's really made me understand that it's collaborative. Like at the end of the
Yeah.
day, you are the one who has to go back home and hole yourself up with your laptop and write the thing.
Right.
But along the way, like you have so many people around you who can help. Like
Right.
I'm always like, my mom and my sister are like huge readers and supporters of mine. And my boyfriend's a filmmaker, so he has really interesting ideas and a really interesting
Yeah.
perspective on story. Um, it's 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 a collaboration,
Yeah.
and that was like a great lesson that I've learned writing this and publishing it.
And it's interesting too, because I think one of the hard things too is I identify as an early author, and
Mhm.
actually at any point, even now, like I'm 20 or 16 or 18 books in, and it still feels like there are moments where I'm like, whose voice do you trust, right? There's a part of like, you have to find you have to find what works for you, but sometimes like
Mhm.
when you're too in it, you're like, you can't even see the sort of the forest for the trees, or so it's kind of
Yeah.
like you have to find people that that you can whose voice you trust, whose
Mhm.
responses you trust. Then you also have to sort of figure out where you fit and all that, and so it's like a very complicated process, and imposter syndrome is real, and I'm
Oh
here to
yeah.
say it's still real. It's 25
Never
years
goes
real.
away.
It never goes away. In fact, I had Sandra Brown on the podcast, who's written,
Mhm.
100 and whatever. She's got like 90 New York Times bestsellers. And she's like, every time I start a book, I look at the bookshelf and be like, okay, you can do this. You've done this before. And she says, every time I think, I don't think I can do this again. And I'm like, if she's going
Yeah.
to feel that way, then that's it, right? It's all of us forever.
Yeah.
So I do think it's right. It's collaboration, but it's also super um, individual. It's a very
Yeah.
bizarre um, field to be in. Really, right?
Absolutely. Yes. Yes, it is.
Yeah. So, and the MFA, like that's interesting. So I did my MFA, but
Mhm.
I already had I had a bunch of books. I had 4 books out already before I did my MFA. So I went back to kind of
Oh
try to write
wow.
more in a more literary
That's so
fashion.
cool.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, sort of, it was weird, but they were, they're genre books, and I wrote a literary book, and I came back because I love the genre. I think, to your
Yeah.
point, the thriller creates this momentum, like you said, an engine, right? That you can talk about, you can address anything, like you said, sexuality, power dynamics. I mean, those are actually rife in thriller novels, right? I mean, that's
Yeah.
those are perfect. But any, like, you know, a mother's grief and you know, and duplicity and you know, and all the layers of like how a marriage ends. I mean, there's all these beautiful themes you have in the Wayside that are not necessarily thriller elements, right? But captured in the sort of frame of a thriller, everything is the it's like a little bit heightened, right? I feel like that's the thing that
Yeah.
thrillers do. They create this sort of heightened sense of stakes,
Yes.
right? It's life or death. And even though, you know, Kate's there when Jake's already gone, and there's not necessarily a real risk to her, there's also a real risk to her, right? Not just emotionally, which obviously she has, but also physically. I mean, and that I think just it's really fun to read. Plus, people just we love thrillers, right? It's like romance and thrillers. I don't know why, but that's
I
what
know.
people love. That's what people. So, is your
Yeah.
next book got thriller elements?
Not as such. So
Yeah.
what I'm working on now is something that I had started before The Wayside, and this is separate from my first novel. I started it before The Wayside came into my life, and then I set it aside because I cannot work on two things at the same time.
Yeah.
That seems impossible to me.
Yes.
So I picked it back up about 6 months ago, and I can say with like 100% certainty that this book is better now after having written The Wayside and after having worked in the thriller space,
Yeah.
than it was before I'd had the experience of the thriller.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's sort of like a coming of adulthood story, I would say. The protagonist is 29. She's like knocking down the door of 30. And like when I was turning 30, I had like a mental breakdown.
I mean,
really,
right?
but I was nervous. I was scared. Yeah.
There's a moment of crisis for sure.
Yeah. And then you get to your 30s and you're like, oh, this is actually amazing.
Yeah.
But there's a supernatural element that comes into play as well. So like not a thriller, but there's like a hint of genre.
Yeah.
And I fell in love with genre also when I was writing The Wayside.
Well, first off, I want to say every decade gets better. So you can just like when you get to 40, you'll feel the same way.
I can't wait. Yeah.
And I'm 50, I'm in my 50s. So when you get to 50, it seems impossible, but also it's every decade's better. So that's good, at least so far. But then the other thing I think is that like what I love again about publishing is like, I don't know if you know Emma Jean. She's written a couple of YAs, Tokyo Ever After and another one. And then she just wrote her first adult thriller. And I think people are doing this thing where if like you find you love an author, you love their writing, you'll follow them to a different type of style book. And I think it's up to the publisher to make it clear what kind of book we're reading. Now, will Blackstone take that one? We don't know yet.
Oh, I don't know. It's still very much in the draft phase. So we'll have to see. But
yeah, well, it's exciting. I mean, I have to give them Blackstone props. They're doing so many amazing things.
I know.
They're just come out. I mean, hadn't even heard of them 4 years ago. So they're just really, and they've got some really super heavy hitters, and it's a really exciting. And I like to see that too because we're so used to the sort of traditional big whatever they are
big
now. I
five,
don't even know. Yeah,
maybe 3 now. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, right? It's so right. It's gotten so compacted, and so it's so wonderful. Well, I love that. Okay, so tell us when you wrote your sort of coming of age, your original first novel. What was the process for that? Like, where did that? You know, you obviously queried agents, and that's sort of. It sounds like it's been set aside for now. Did you get feedback from agents, and how did you handle that? Like that's it's a process of, again, like whose voice do you listen to?
Yeah, it's hard. I was listening to a lot of voices because I started writing. I mean, I kind of started writing it when I was 18 when I wrote a short story that featured the two protagonists. But I started writing the novel in earnest my first year of my MFA program when I was 23. when I was in workshop, I was listening to my my peers and my teachers and my readers. And then when I was querying agents, I was listening to the agents. So it definitely like it's a really important practice, I think, for writers to come back to center. And
Yeah.
One of my teachers at NYU said, if you come out of workshop and the only comment that you remember is either really positive or really negative, then they're probably right. Like,
There's
so
something
the
to
really
it, right?
negative stuff, there's something to it, unless they like have a personal vendetta against you, but like likely that's not the case. Like if they have a really strong reaction to what you're writing, even if you hate hearing it, there's probably truth to it. And if there's something really positive, like I think positive feedback is just as important, if not more important than the critical feedback. So yeah, I sent the novel out to agents. I probably queried like around 8, which seemed like a lot at the time, but is nothing.
Nothing, yeah.
It's nothing. So I was getting sort of like positive rejections, and I got like I actually got some really useful feedback from the agents as far as like what's missing, how can it be changed to be better marketed to publishers and to readers. So I also like I had a freelance editor help me with it. I was like in that sort of 17th editing phase with the novel, and that's when the Wayside came in. So it's it's not an easy process.
No, it's not an easy process. And I think, it's interesting because I also feel like it's so subjective, right? I mean, somebody can really hate your book. I mean, we know this from like books like Gone Girl. Some people hate that book, or The Girl on the Train, right? And then some people are just like, it's the best book ever. So I almost feel like you still have to figure out who to listen to. And, and even at my stage, an editor will say something and I'll be like, oh, that makes sense. And then and then somebody else will say something that they feel really strongly. I'm like, it doesn't resonate. Like it's like you have to translate all the noise into something that sort of is a vibrational match for how you feel about your book, which is just damn near impossible, right? It's just, and and then you have to take time away from it. So that book is still there. So it's a book of your heart. I'm sure it's
absolutely it is. Yeah.
And so hopefully you get a chance to come back to that, right?
Thank you. Yeah. I still, again, I love that book. That book is like my heart and my soul, as I think a lot of first novels are.
Yeah.
And I absolutely, it's not in the garbage. It's in a drawer that I can return to one day. But I feel, excited about this other project I'm working on and like just kind of moving forward.
Yeah. And I think, as you said, like you feel like a much better writer because you wrote this book.
Totally.
And I think I think that people also can get really stuck on the idea that this is the book that has to get published first, or this is the book that I need to get published. And really it's like Malcolm Gladwell talks about 10,000 hours. I mean, really the process of writing books, and if one doesn't work, then you write another one, and if that doesn't work, then you write. I mean, that's, I think, really, it's as valuable as anything else about the process, right? It's just doing it over and over and over again. So
yes, there's really no shortcut. Like there's no hack. Like there's no perfect schedule that you can follow that'll get the book done. Like at the end of the day, you have to sit down and do it every day.
I think
which gets easier. It does get easier over time because it just becomes sort of habituated into your process. But I think also a lot of writers, including me, are cursed with like, we love writing and we hate it so much and it's incredibly hard. But I think the more you do it too, the more you sort of can like push past that initial like, resistance, like I don't want to do it. But
people say it's like a runner's high. Now I don't run. I only run if I'm being chased. That's what I always say. But I do think it's similar to that. Like I think, when you get like the highs of writing are so high. There's
nothing like it. Yeah.
It's so magical. And the lows really suck. So
horrible.
I think it's like you said, it's a muscle. So if you use, the more you use it, and I think you're right. And I do find that thing about every day, which is hard for people but I think if you can touch your book even just 10 or 15 or 30 minutes a
Yes,
day,
exactly.
it does. I think it is absolutely makes a huge difference, because those are people that have to live inside you for years, right? So,
Yeah. That's definitely a good barometer of whether you want to or should be working on a project, is like, after you get that over that resistance, are you happy to be with these characters? Are you
yeah,
excited to see what they do? Or do you
yeah,
hate every part of it? And if you
yeah.
do,
Then you need another project, or you're not a writer.
yeah,
I mean, and that's, people
yeah,
say, "Oh, I can write a book," and I'm like, "You should do it. That sounds awesome."
yeah,
But I do think, and it actually brings me to one more question I want to ask you,
yeah.
which is about, you said what these characters are going to do. How is your process? Are you, you obviously had sort of, with the Wayside, it was different because you had you had a bit of a map, if you will, right?
Yeah.
Not an outline though, but a map. So did you
Hmm.
outline from that, or did you just sit down and sort of start to go? Because that, people have really different
Yeah,
styles.
totally. Yeah. I think I did. Also, I wrote it like 3.5 years ago, which is also
Yeah.
so weird about the publishing process.
Yes. Right.
But I fleshed out the outline. Um, but along the way, I didn't hew to that original outline, the whole way through.
Hmm.
But that gave me sort of like guardrails as to like, okay,
Yeah.
this is where this character has to be. This is where this point in the plot has to happen. Um, so for this book, it was really a combination of the outline, because I had the plot mapped out, and just kind of working intuitively, and then also researching in places that required research.
Yeah, yeah, there's a lot of,
You know,
right, there's a lot of stuff in there that is, yeah. What about this
yeah,
book? So now you're writing a book sort of
yeah,
without that process. And what's your sort of method been for this so far?
yeah. So for this book, I have like a loose outline. I know where the story ends,
Yeah.
and I know like the major sort of beats that have to happen to get there.
Hmm.
Um, and I will say it's like incredibly satisfying to go back to your original outline and like strike out, that
Yeah,
bullet. You're like, yes, I got that done. Let's move on to the next.
totally.
But this too, I'm definitely an intuitive writer. And I let the characters do whatever they need to do.
Right.
And so I'll just sort of roll with it. Like I'm not, nothing's written in stone. It's so much a process of discovery.
Right, because as you get to know them, they make their own choices, which I know every
Yeah,
sounds really like multiple personality disorder, but
completely. Yeah.
it is like, and I always find if I get stuck somewhere in a book, it's because I have forced something on a character,
Yeah,
and he or she is like, that's not the right choice for me, and I have to be like,
totally.
back up. So it is, and I'm that way too. I mean, there are people, obviously, lots of them, fabulously talented, successful people who make a whole outline and really stick to it.
Yeah.
I kind of sometimes wish that I could do that, but
Me too.
it's not how it doesn't work for me. So
Yeah, me
yeah.
too.
Yeah. So, well, this is so exciting. Okay, so I'm going to show this beautiful cover again, because it's so exciting, and I love that, and I love, like, there's a little bit of journal in there, and
Hmm.
the burned out mansion at the top of the building is so, so fabulous. So
Yeah.
anyway, this is really exciting, Caroline.
Thank you.
Congratulations so much on your debut.
Thank
And
you so much.
the book is out today. This is airing on the day that your book is
Yes.
out. So
Yes.
you get to go right this second and download it or order it and read it. And I enjoyed it so much. And I felt all the plights of all the characters really strongly, which I think is a really impressive thing. So congratulations.
Thank you so much, Danielle. I really appreciate it.
Super exciting. Tell our listeners where to find you online if they want to, follow you and hear what you're up to and all that good stuff.
Yeah. So spoiler alert, Caroline Wolff is actually a pseudonym. My real name is
Okay.
Caroline, but Wolff is not my real last name. It's a family name. So I just I just created an Instagram handle for Caroline Wolff. which is
saw
at
that.
Caroline Wolff author. Wolff is with 2 F's. So you can reach me there. I'll be posting a lot more, over the coming weeks and months, hopefully years.
Yeah.
So that's the best place for kind of Wayside
Perfect.
book news.
Perfect. And I'm sure you can find the Wayside on Goodreads and on on your bookstores. And
Everywhere,
if they don't have it, you can ask for it. That's always the best thing you can do to support an author is if you don't see their book in a bookstore, say, why don't you have this book?
Yes.
So
please do that.
Exactly. So congratulations again. It was so fun to have you on the show. I love to hear about, the excitement of a debut novel. And I hope it beats all of your expectations.
Thank you so much.
Thank you everyone for joining us. This is Killer Women with Caroline Wolff, and we will see you next time. Bye.